Karen saw her neighborhood as her domain, a place where everyone was in their place, until he moved in. A new black neighbor whose very presence disrupted her peace. Thinking she was upholding justice, Karen called the police. But her suspicion fell on none other than the director of the FBI, leading anti-discrimination efforts in law enforcement. Her world began to crumble as she realized her prejudice could bring devastating consequences. Karen Whitfield, a woman in her mid-40s, took pride in her life of order and decorum. She was fair-skinned, with meticulously styled blonde hair and flawless makeup, projecting an image of elegance and control. In her upscale suburb, she had created what she saw as a perfect slice of paradise. Her days were a routine of morning jogs along tree-lined streets, breakfast at her favorite cafe, followed by lunches with friends, and afternoons dedicated to community improvement committees and event planning. To her, this neighborhood was more than just home. It was her domain, a place where everything was as it should be, and everyone knew their place. When a new neighbor moved in next door, Karen's carefully ordered life began to feel threatened. He was a black man around 50, dressed casually in plain shirts and jeans, starkly different from the polished men in suits she was used to. He was unlike the neighbor she had long grown comfortable with. His presence alone seemed out of sync with the rhythm of her world. And it wasn't just his appearance that unsettled her. He frequently had visitors, people of all ages, from teenagers to elderly individuals, coming and going at all hours. To Karen, the scene was nothing short of suspicious. She couldn't understand what drew so many people to him and began to worry that he might be dangerous. One afternoon, while out with her coffee on the porch, she saw him laughing and chatting with a group of young people gathered on his steps. Karen's gaze lingered as he gestured with open friendliness, his voice carrying across the yard in animated conversation. To her, his smile looked too comfortable, too friendly. The ease with which he interacted with others made her uneasy, as if his warmth and openness were somehow a facade. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was faking his friendliness, and in her mind, it translated into a threat to the decency and order she had long maintained in the community. Her thoughts spiraled that day, each worry adding fuel to the next. By the time she returned to her house, she was nearly trembling with anxiety. She glanced back at the porch where he stood, a knot of apprehension growing in her chest. After a few moments, Karen made a decision. She would call the police. Picking up the phone with a tense grip, she reported him as a suspicious person, describing his presence as unsettling and out of place, saying he didn't fit and made her feel unsafe. In that moment, Karen felt she was protecting the neighborhood, unaware of the drastic consequences her actions would unleash. A patrol car finally pulled up to her neighbor's driveway, its lights flashing, casting an eerie red and blue glow that filled Karen with a twisted sense of satisfaction. From her living room window, she observed the scene with an intense gaze, savoring each moment. Two uniformed officers, tall and serious, stepped out of the car, adjusting their belts and glancing at each other before walking toward the house. They moved with purpose, expressions focused and unyielding, as though preparing for a significant confrontation. Her neighbor, still engaged in cheerful conversation on his porch, was oblivious to the unfolding scene at first. His laughter mingled with that of his guests, a relaxed group of young people chatting and joking together, seemingly at home. But when one of the young people noticed the officers, the mood shifted. Laughter faded into silence, smiles gave way to guarded expressions, and the neighbor himself turned, raising an eyebrow in quiet surprise. He seemed calm, but there was a flicker of confusion in his eyes, a moment of trying to piece together why two officers were standing in his yard. The officers requested his identification with formal professionalism. Karen leaned forward, barely breathing, as she watched him reach calmly into his pocket, retrieve his ID, and hand it over. He spoke with a steady voice, explaining who he was and introducing his guests, his words reaching Karen as fragments in the breeze. One of the officers examined the ID, studying it closely, while his partner kept a steady gaze on the neighbor, as though waiting for something to go wrong. Then, something unexpected happened. The officer inspecting the ID suddenly shifted his expression, from uncertainty to understanding. A flash of recognition crossed his face as he took a step back, exchanging a look with his partner that was hard to decipher. The first officer leaned toward his colleague, speaking in a low tone, his words muffled but unmistakably respectful. There was a nod, a quick agreement, and Karen felt a pang of unease begin to replace her earlier sense of satisfaction. The officer handed back the ID, this time with a distinct air of respect, saying a few polite words that Karen couldn't quite make out. Her neighbor accepted his ID with a courteous nod, his expression unreadable but calm, as if he had expected this all along. Without further questioning, the officers retreated, walking back to the patrol car with quiet efficiency, no trace of alarm or suspicion left in their movements. Karen's pulse quickened, her confidence wavering. What had she missed? Her satisfaction dissolved into confusion as she watched the patrol car drive away, the lights fading into the distance. Her neighbor turned back to his guests, resuming the conversation with a knowing smile, his calm demeanor undisturbed. Karen, on the other hand, remained at her window, gripped by a growing sense of dread and bewilderment. It was clear she hadn't fully grasped who her neighbor truly was, and a subtle fear crept into her mind that maybe, just maybe, she had made a mistake that could cost her far more than she had anticipated. The next day, Karen woke up confident her call to the police had been justified. But as she stepped onto her porch, she noticed a commotion at her neighbor's house. A police car was parked nearby, along with several journalists with cameras and microphones, capturing statements on the go. Assistants, photographers, and reporters were bustling around. Anxiety crept over her. She wondered why her neighbor was suddenly the center of attention. Thoughts raced through her mind. Perhaps the police had found something that validated her suspicions. But then she noticed something that unnerved her further. Several police officers greeted her neighbor with clear respect, nodding at him as if he were their superior. Throughout the day, whispers among the neighbors reached her. At first, the news seemed implausible, but eventually, she confirmed what she had heard. Her new neighbor wasn't just an ordinary citizen, but the director of the FBI, in charge of investigating corruption and discrimination within law enforcement. His presence in their neighborhood was part of a covert assessment of local law enforcement agencies. Gripped with horror, Karen's hands trembled, her face paled, and she felt faint at the thought that her call to the police might have risked a conflict with federal authorities, casting her as prejudiced and unjustifiably suspicious. She began to understand that her actions had severe implications, not only for her reputation, but also for her safety. Her prejudice and rash actions were far more dangerous than she could have anticipated. Later that day, her neighbor decided to speak with her. He approached her house, and as she nervously opened the door, she felt a chill run down her spine. She forced a weak smile to hide her fear and shame. Her neighbor, calm and dignified, explained that he knew about her call to the police and understood that her actions had been driven by certain stereotypes and biases. With gentle firmness, he warned her about the dangers of such hasty judgments, explaining how easily they could lead to unnecessary conflicts and even law enforcement involvement. His words were firm but devoid of aggression. He didn't belittle or insult her, but made it clear that her actions could impact not just her own reputation, but the atmosphere of the entire community. In his eyes, Karen saw disappointment, but also a hope that she might reconsider her views. Listening to him, she began to grasp the depth of her error, feeling her previous certainty dissolve into shame and regret. After meeting with her neighbor, Karen felt her familiar world starting to fall apart. But in that unraveling, she found an opportunity for change. Her conversation with him awakened long-suppressed doubts about her beliefs and forced her to view her surroundings in a new light. For the first time, she realized that her fears and prejudices had been unfounded, built on ignorance and stereotypes, a painful revelation. She started small, attending local improvement committee meetings, but now aiming to contribute ideas she previously hadn't considered. She proposed organizing events to promote diversity and cooperation within the community. For example, she suggested a neighborhood picnic in the local park, inviting all residents to get to know each other better. Karen gathered a team of volunteers to help with the event, ensuring everyone, regardless of background or status, felt included. As she immersed herself in this work, her mindset began to shift profoundly. Karen recognized that her previous life in an ideal world was merely a facade, concealing a void and fear of the unknown. Now, her surroundings seemed much more vibrant and alive, and she found joy in making positive changes. At a neighborhood event, she noticed her neighbor standing nearby, watching her with a slight smile as she coordinated the activities. Eventually, he approached her, appreciating her efforts, and offered to let bygones be bygones, suggesting they start fresh. He invited her to dinner as a symbol of reconciliation and mutual commitment to building a better future for the entire neighborhood. Karen gratefully accepted his invitation, understanding that this dinner was not only a chance to make amends, but also a step toward genuine, trusting relationships. That evening, they spoke like old friends, discussing not only the neighborhood's issues and successes, but also the importance of understanding, openness, and kindness. The dinner symbolized not only their personal reconciliation, but also the beginning of a new life, where understanding and unity replaced prejudice.